Chapter 1, page 1, opens with some jargon that might be a little bit difficult for a 21st century reader to understand, but the image being evoked would have been immediately meaningful to the readers alive when this was first published during Karl Marx's own lifetime. Opens with the words, "The history of all hitherto existing societies is the history of class struggle. Freeman and slave, patrician and pleb." Patrician and plebeian. Right? What does class struggle mean? I think it's very difficult for people now in the year 2019 to understand the intensity and the gravity that the study of Latin brought to Europe in the late 18th century and then throughout the whole of the 19th century. Why is the city of Cincinnati called Cincinnati? Look into it. The men who fought in the American Revolution and established the United States of America, they studied intensely and really responded to even the kind of smallest details of the political history of Athens and Rome. And some of them were more interested in the social model offered by Athens, and some of them were more interested in Rome. Likewise, in reading the history of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic period following after it, this intense, profound obsession with classical learning, ancient Greece and Rome, and it's much more than symbolic. I mean, what they learned from the study of that history, it led to, for example, Karl Marx's theory of class struggle. All right? Now, class struggle, today, 2019, people might think of a gay pride parade. They might think of public demonstrations with flags and songs, and maybe there's some police brutality, maybe there's some tension, maybe there's some news coverage with nasty words being spoken back and forth. Nobody reading this in 2019 has evoked in their mind's eye the image of what those struggles really were between patrician and plebeian, freedman and slave. So I don't mean to insult you in the audience, but I'm going to make a follow-up video to this where I give you block quotations of just how brutal class war was, just how unbelievably sanguine class struggle really was in ancient Greece and Rome. And it's not just that we today have documentary evidence of what it was like when the plebs and the patricians were at war with each other in the streets of ancient Rome. Those accounts were being read by Karl Marx and all of his contemporaries. They knew these specific descriptions of fighting in the streets, of the rich against the poor, about class interest dividing Roman society, and they read about, the murder of, innocent little babies, people being starved and burned alive on fire, unbelievably brutal struggles for who was to control the destiny of Rome and various city-states in Greece. We don't just have records from Athens that way. Those accounts, those descriptions, they're really moving, and they'll give you nightmares. And they really did directly inspire the class analysis of society that we find in Karl Marx. In some ways, it's become more difficult for people to understand because so few of the people reading Marx have actually read, for example, Aristotle, although Aristotle is not our only witness to that history. Now, why was ancient Rome so susceptible to class analysis? Why was ancient Rome so susceptible to this view that society is divided into distinct class interests and that each class in society pursues its own interest? And then I could repeat all of that with ancient Athens. Well, both Athens and Rome were formally and explicitly divided into social classes. Broadly speaking, Rome and all of the Greek city-states, there were many significantly, it wasn't just Athens, but broadly speaking, something they had in common was the attempt to positively motivate the payment of taxation by allowing you to participate in government in a different social class depending on how much you paid in taxes. So I am generalizing here. You can read Aristotle and read about specific city-states and how they organize these taxes. But stereotypically, an ancient Greek or ancient Italian city-state would say something like, well, if you really want to participate in government, if you really want to have all the rights of a citizen, it's a loaded term, unfortunately. If you want to be kind of a first-class citizen, then you have to pay enough in taxation to provide the government with 2 heavily armed soldiers. All right, now it differs from city-state to city-state. There's one city-state in specific I read about where actually the tax requirement to be a kind of first-class citizen was really low. But in others, it might be very significant, where it's like, well, you need to be able to provide us with 1 horse and 1 fully armed soldier. And when they're going through the documentary evidence, it also seems that in some city-states, it was more literally that you had to provide like a sword and a shield and a suit of armor. And in some, it was, well, you just have to pay a certain amount of money in taxes each year. That would be enough money to buy a suit of armor, something like this. So you can imagine in the ancient world, one of the reasons why this mode of organization was so important was that there was no surveillance state. There was no way for them to check your bank account or track your credit card. The ability of the state to negatively enforce taxation, the ability of the state to motivate you to pay your taxes because of the threat of punishment if you do not, that was very weak. But if you have a state set up where you say, okay, well, there's a special dining hall over here, and you can only eat in that dining hall if you've paid taxes over a certain amount to support the war effort or to support keeping an army even during peacetime, those sorts of things really positively motivated conformity and public political participation. So Athens and Rome, and it changes from one period to the next too. We have evidence over many centuries. It changes from city to city, and it changes historically as time goes by. But broadly speaking, you tended to have a very acute awareness of, for instance, who was in the top 1/5 of the income distribution of society, who was in the 2/5, who was in the 3/5. In many of these societies, they literally had named groups like this for different social classes by quintile or by quartile. They would assign you to a tribe, although it's not tribe in our sense of the word today, based on your income and what part of the city you sat in, and then you might have representation and participate in government on that basis. You'd also participate in the military in a different way, depending on your social class, and your sons would have a different status in the military depending on your social class, also based on your neighborhood and your tribe. And this actually created incredibly tight bonds with society. This is part of why there was so much pride taken in serving in the military. People would serve in the military and they would dine with and go to war with familiar faces that they knew. They wouldn't be serving with strangers because they would serve with the same people whom they saw in these kind of village councils, these various semi-democratic forms of representational government that they participated in, and many of those also involve just eating meals together and this kind of thing. So, yes, ancient Rome and ancient Athens, you can read some kind of blood-curdling descriptions, some horrifying descriptions of what those societies were like when the relationships between classes broke down, when the patricians were at war with the plebs. And that did happen again and again. It's a colorful history. However, it's incredibly misleading to look back at the history of ancient Rome and ancient Athens as if they were perpetually and only in a state of class warfare. As if, for example, there was no class mobility. As if in Athens it was impossible to be born in the poorer quintile and work your way up to a more wealthy social stratum and so on. Not just issues of social mobility, but also just friendship and intermarriage and so on. That, these people lived together and worked together. And of course, if they didn't, their society, would have collapsed. So, again, it's easy to kind of remember Rome entirely in terms of its civil wars. It's easy, and genuinely, Marx was appealing to a readership who knew that history, who'd read those evocative passages. It was easy for Marx to appeal to his audience's imagination with this notion of class struggle because they knew what it meant to talk about the wars of patricians versus plebeians. And it's much more difficult to explain what the advantages were of that society, how the social classes actually most of the time lived together in harmony, worked together in harmony, and had a somewhat democratic system of representative and participatory government. Even Rome, I mean, I regard Rome as much less democratic than ancient Athens was, but nevertheless, the type of representation and participation that people had in government that really mattered to people, and it really motivated them to pay their taxes. All government authority ultimately rests on your ability to collect taxes and then spend it on the public's behalf. So with that having been said, when you're looking at the start of this text and you're looking at the end of this text, the overall structure and ideological function of the argument that Karl Marx presents here is to pose a problem and then exaggerate how terrible the problem is so that the reader loses interest in any particular solution. So here we're talking about Chapter 1, Part 1, the beginning of the text, the first installment, the analysis of Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx. But toward the end of the text, Marx just ridicules any notion of a utopian model of what the future should be, right? So if you've read the text before, you may vaguely recall this. And keep in mind, someone during Marx's lifetime sitting down to study this text, they could reasonably expect Marx to present us with a utopian model of the future, and Marx might even be expected to, give us some kind of plausible explanation for why it is that his method, his approach, is the way to get from our present society to that future utopia, why it is that he understands better than some other utopian philosopher both the problems in our society and the solutions, what should be done to rectify it. And Marx instead, he kind of upsets the apple cart. He challenges the reader. He overthrows that expectation, and he just ridicules the whole history of prior communists, people who were called communists and sometimes called themselves communists. He says, oh, no, all these communists in the past with their utopian thinking, they're no better than Christian fundamentalists. They're no better than, religious revolutionaries who promised heaven on earth, who promised, the kingdom of God on earth. These crazy utopian visions, we're not like that. Marx is presenting himself as some kind of hard-nosed, materialist, down-to-earth revolutionary who laughs at, who scoffs at all notions of utopia. He's not giving you a model of a better future at all. No. He's just presenting you with how terrible the society you're in is. The society you are presently in is presented as unbelievably terrible. He presents the working class, specifically the industrial proletariat, so specifically factory workers, he presents as just being chosen by history to be the solution to that problem. And then he says, get out and make revolution. So he's calling for violence here and now, specifically class struggle, class war, specifically the type of class struggle that you see in patrician against plebeian. Again, these are evocative images from ancient Rome, to some extent also from ancient Greece, that the readers would have known. He's calling for that kind of violence on the streets now, and he's calling for it in the absence of any utopia, in the absence of any promises made to the reader, such as all those other authors had made. He names specific authors as examples that we're supposed to laugh at as being terribly misguided. So that is the structure and ideological function of the text. So chapter 1 opens first with a sort of praise of the bourgeoisie. He states all the amazing accomplishments of the middle class in transforming the world, bringing about the demolition of the old feudal society of the Dark Ages. Now, almost nobody would bother to criticize this, but it should be pointed out, this is basically fiction. We then have a turning point when the fiction becomes quite a bit more difficult to bear, where he switches from naming all of the accomplishments and virtues of the bourgeois class to describing the bourgeois class as the vampires of our society. So I'll read a paragraph here from the turning point in the text. This is where he's just getting into his condemnation of the bourgeoisie and bourgeois society as it's been recreated under bourgeois leadership. The bourgeoisie, wherever it has got the upper hand, has put an end to all feudal, patriarchal, idyllic relations. It has pitilessly torn asunder the motley feudal ties that bound man to his quote-unquote natural superiors, and has left remaining no other nexus between man and man than naked self-interest, than callous cash payment. It has drowned the most heavenly ecstasies of religious fervor, of chivalrous enthusiasm, of Philistine sentimentalism in the icy water of egotistical calculation. It has resolved personal worth into exchange value, and in place of the numberless and indefeasible chartered freedoms, has set up that single, unconscionable freedom, free trade. In one word, for exploitation, veiled by religious and political illusions, naked, shameless, direct, brutal exploitation. Now, again, in terms of the structure of the text, the function of what he's doing here ideologically, what's really important to keep in mind is he's not just making a case for the industrial proletariat being a special class, that the factory workers are a special group of people, which, not totally preposterous. He's making the case that the industrial proletariat, factory workers, represent the best interests of our whole society, that they are the ones who can and will destroy the bourgeoisie, and the bourgeoisie are so terrible that they deserve to be destroyed, and that the world will be a better place when the factory workers do that. This is not obvious. I mean, when you think about it in terms of the burden of evidence, the burden of proof, what you'd have to do to convince me of that, it's considerable. Right now, I may dislike the government of Canada. I do. I dislike who's in power in Canada. Does that mean I imagine Canada would be better off if a bunch of potato farmers from Prince Edward Island, kicked all the bourgeois people out of government, kicked out the middle class people, and took over in a coup d'etat led by potato farmers? No, I don't think that would be better. The government we've got is bad, but that would be even worse. Do I think the government would be improved if a group of factory workers, people who manufacture cars in a car factory? No, I don't believe that. You'd have to convince me that particular coup d'etat would somehow improve our society. The other big, deep change he's trying to bring about in his reader's perception of the universe is the assumption that class interest is your only interest, that class struggle is the only struggle. Now, that is not just rhetoric. The point is, and he makes this at some length, even in chapter 1 here, he says at some length that he thinks for the proletariat, for the factory workers, nationalism is dead. Party affiliation politics are dead. That the factory workers somehow are so transformed by the horror of working in a factory, or something about being a factory worker, so transform them that they no longer participate in nationalism of any kind. Now, okay, what a claim. Of course, this has never been true, and it's still not true today. People can work in a factory and be conservative. In Canada, the vast majority of factory workers are. The vast majority of blue-collar, working-class people in Canada are conservative. You can work in a factory and be a nationalist. People can work in a factory and intensely hate the French or hate the Spanish, local rivalries within Europe and so on. So it's quite a bit deeper than just stereotyping. He's trying to create the illusion, which again ultimately is inspired by and comes out of the study of ancient Greece and Rome. It comes out of nothing else. It does not come out of Hegel. It does not come out of the study of the history of China or India, all of which Karl Marx dabbled in. The mature Marx is not derivative of Hegel. Look at Marx's youngest writings. Okay, there's a little bit of influence. He's imitating Hegel a little bit here and there. Nothing of the kind is going on here. But the idea that class interest is your only interest, and then you give up all fealty to particular kings, particular religions, the idea that the industrial proletariat, the idea that factory workers are nihilists, that they've lost any sense of attachment to the Catholic Church or the Protestant Church, it was completely untrue when Karl Marx was alive. It's still completely untrue today. So inviting the reader to imagine the industrial proletariat as a wrecking ball that is doomed and determined to smash into and destroy bourgeois society. Yes, on the one hand, we're supposed to imagine that because we are first told that the bourgeois class itself was a wrecking ball that destroyed the aristocracy, that destroyed the society of the Middle Ages or even of the Renaissance period. Now, of course, that's also untrue. I mean, that's completely fictional. It's a ridiculous reading of the history of Europe, and it's also a ridiculous reading in terms of the personalities and political motivations of who the bourgeois class are. The bourgeois class have not, in fact, reduced everything to mere dollars and cents. The bourgeois class remain powerfully attached to nationalism, religion, various political interests of their time and place. But the bourgeois class is interpreted and presented here only in terms of their class interest, and the working class then likewise. Now, again, in ancient Greece and ancient Rome, class interest was very highly mobilized because that was how their government worked. That was how their form of public religion even worked. And that was how their tax collection worked. And in the societies we live in, both now and in Karl Marx's time, the comparison to ancient Greece and Rome is very weak. And of course, we also are not a slave society. So there are many significant differences. I just mentioned there was a time in my life when I did a lot of research on history, politics, and society of India. One of the misconceptions about the history of India is that many Europeans, many Americans and Europeans, when they read the history of India, they assume that each caste within the caste system, so a caste is similar to a social class, I'm not going to get into the differences, but each social class, so to speak, in India, that they were naturally allied to the other members of their social class and enemies of the other social classes. And what you have to understand in working through documentary evidence and historical evidence, that's really not true. On the contrary, the way social classes were organized in India, you'd have a situation where members of the same group all had the same profession, and they were very much in competition with one another. Whereas, by and large, their allies and colleagues would be people from other social classes. So even if it's just something as simple as this is kind of a bad example. All right, you owned a factory in ancient India that bought up rice and sugar and transformed it into sugar candies, like our jujubes, mushed up rice and sugar, and you add some coloring and juice, make it into candy. That's already attested in ancient India, in the Pali Canon and the ancient Buddhist scriptures. So guys, candy making in India has been around for 3,000 years. Okay, so that's a real ancient. So there's actually a very powerful social tendency whereby the candy maker will be friends with the rice farmers and will be friends with whoever he buys sweetener from. It's, this is ancient India, so it's not going to be sugar cane. I don't know. Maybe it would be sugar. Okay, I don't know. Wherever they're going to get the sugar and the rice from and so on, those people they tend to be colleagues with. Whereas their rival candy makers, even though they're members of the same caste, that's a much more difficult situation. So in the same way, in Marx's time, the assumption that middle-class businessmen, that bourgeois businessmen have a solidarity of businessmen, that they don't regard one another as competition, that they don't hate and deride one another and have, sneering rivalries with one another or something, or vendettas against one another, that there isn't warfare within one class as opposed to warfare between social classes. That's another profoundly false assumption. And again, it's maybe easier to be deceived by that sort of thing if you're thinking about a far-off, distant, romanticized foreign culture, where there's a barrier of language and culture and so on. Within our own culture, I think we all implicitly understand that the owner of one television network may really not feel a sense of class solidarity with the owner of another television network. They're competitors, they may despise each other, so on and so forth. So there's really no reason to assume that class rivalry is between classes instead of within classes. Because there are many, many problems that are implicit within the text, but obvious to my eyes in 2019. Okay, so we then get a whole series of complaints about the bourgeoisie that are simply factually false. Firstly, the bourgeoisie cannot exist without constantly revolutionizing the instruments of production and thereby the relations of production and with them the whole of society. Nope. This is just a false claim. No, you can have a bourgeois middle class in an economically stagnant society. If you were living through the Industrial Revolution, maybe you would believe, as Marx did, that the Industrial Revolution was just going to keep on revolutionizing society at the same pace. But nope. We invented the toilet, and to an amazing extent, the toilet and plumbing just didn't change. We invented electricity. Yeah, we do more creative things with electricity. But it's not the case that technological change and the transformation of society continued to be, fundamental technologies like the toilet and plumbing and train tracks and trains, to a shocking extent, there was this early period of innovation where those things were new, and then in many, many ways, for centuries, they fundamentally didn't change. So no, I mean, this is also kind of hilarious because when you think about it, Marx is presenting the bourgeoisie to the reader as if the bourgeoisie represent constant, radical, revolutionary change. And we don't regard them that way. Even if you're a left-winger, even if you're a socialist or a communist, you associate the bourgeoisie with status quo conservative values, right? With keeping things the same. So there's a problem here. No, these claims that the bourgeoisie, they were bringing about this revolution and they're just going to keep on doing it. They're going to keep on radically transforming the society with this unbelievable economic and technological progress. Nope. We invented the stock exchange and, adding computers to the stock exchange really didn't change it very much in terms of the fundamental function of the stock exchange, the bank, the way banking works, the way the various elements of capitalist society work, the way even elections work and democracy works. It's shocking how little those things have changed after a brief period of innovation surrounding the Industrial Revolution. Okay, so again, one of the common delusions that communists and far left wingers have that I've made other videos talking about. So number 2, he claims, quote, the need for a constantly expanding market for its products chases the bourgeoisie everywhere, all over the globe. Close quote. The idea here that capitalism requires infinite growth and constant growth is just false. You can have an economically stagnant society, and that society will be better off with a capitalist free market system than with a feudal system or with a communist centralized command economy. So no, and there are examples of countries like Japan that had long periods of economic stagnation or even economic contraction, and capitalism worked just fine, and the middle class worked just fine, so on and so forth. All right, sorry, there were more comments here about how you lose your sense of national self-interest because of this overweening class self-interest, class antagonism. I think I've already talked about that enough. Right, then the next big turning point in the text is when he tries to convince us that working in a factory is slavery. Okay, let's quote this. Quote, modern industry has converted the little workshop of the patriarchal master into the great factory of the industrial capitalist. Masses of laborers crowded into the factory are organized like soldiers. As privates of the industrial army, they are placed under the command of a perfect hierarchy of officers and sergeants. Not only are they slaves of the bourgeois class, I repeat, slaves of the bourgeois class and of the bourgeois state, they are daily and hourly enslaved by the machine, by the overlooker, and above all, by the individual bourgeois manufacturer himself. The more openly this despotism proclaims gain to be its end and aim, the more petty, the more hateful, and the more embittering it is. So this is the idea. I mean, he flirts with this also in Das Kapital from a somewhat different angle, that somehow working in a factory is the most terrible fate imaginable, compared to, interestingly, the bucolic conditions he imagines for workers in a feudal, pre-industrial, pre-capitalist society. It's just false. Even today, 2019 levels of technology, is it worse to be a small shop, self-employed baker, or to work in a large-scale bread factory where you do shift work, like you work for 10 hours at a machine? In a bread factory, believe me, I've looked into this. I went to baking college and got kicked out or dropped out. Long story. But, I studied to be a baker for a significant length of time. At many of the baking factories, you literally work just one machine at one station. So, you may just unload the dough mixer. You may just use the machine that divides the dough into separate small buns. And you do that again and again for 8 hours, and that's it. And then you clean the machine. At the end of the day, you wipe down the machine. So, your labor may be more repetitive and more regular, and in a sense less creative, but there's not a lot of creativity in baking anyway. But the whole factory operates at a much higher level of productivity than the artisanal small shop baker. So everyone can get paid better, everyone can get better benefits. And of course, you get to show up with absolutely no stress on your mind. You work your hours, you clock in, you clock out. The life of an industrial worker, again, it's highly paid, it's rewarding, and you don't have any of the worries of a small entrepreneur who owns his own bakery. Even if you don't own a bakery, if you're just an independent working baker, well, now you have no boss, you have no clock, you maybe don't work with enormous machines, like enormous robotic this type of horrible situation he's describing, huge steel machines that divide the buns for you. Okay, but now you've got to wake up every day. You've got to buy your own ingredients. You've got to worry about how much you're buying, how much you're making, how much you're going to sell it for. Now you are your own boss. You're not oppressed by anybody. There's a lot more stress and a lot more misery in your life. You don't have a team of people working together. You don't have these machines that improve your efficiency. It's a very tough job. Being an independent artisanal baker in many ways is hell on earth compared to working in the factory. Now, everyone knows this who lives in Detroit or something. Working in a car factory is a good job. The reason why people literally left behind life on the farm in more feudal conditions to move to the city to work in factories was indeed that work in those factories offered them a better life, and that is still true today. Of course, there have been struggles. There have been struggles, especially about things like injury and employer accountability when someone loses a finger in a machine. But guess what? Working on the farm, working in a more feudal setting, if you imagine those problems were only in factories, you're wrong. So no, with all that having been said, this is perhaps more false today than it was during Marx's own time. But this ultimately, is relying on a very dishonest fable about how terrible factory work is, rather than any kind of sincere problem-solving mentality and looking at, hey, what are factories? How are they transformed our society? And what should we do to improve conditions for workers? Which indeed is going to include all kinds of petty little laws, including things like lawsuits, so that employees can sue their employer if they lose a factory in a machine, if they lose a finger working at a machine in a factory, this kind of thing. Step by step, those things really did transform the lot of the industrial proletariat in Europe, in America, and around the world. So this section, I feel, closes, my last comment for this chapter of the book today, it closes again by trying to proclaim that class interest takes over all other interests and explains to us that the industrial proletariat are this so-called universal class. Now, that they represent the interests of society as a whole, that the new class to take over society. So in Das Kapital, Marx's longer work, you see the total delusion Marx has that the vast majority of people in society in the future are going to be employed in factories. He's completely wrong. In reality, he was living through a period of time, especially when he was in England. When he's in London, England, he's living through a brief period of time when an extraordinarily high percentage of the population are employed in factories due to unnatural economic conditions created by the British Empire. Long story. Google around. Do you think in the city you live in right now, whoever you are watching this video, do you think that even 15% of the population is employed in factories where you live? It's very unlikely, wherever you live in the world, that even 15% of people are employed in factories. But Marx had the delusion that the industrial workers, the industrial proletariat, factory workers specifically, were going to just take over all of society. So to give an example from Das Kapital that illustrates this, when he talks about all school children having factory jobs in the future, that in the future, school children were going to be able to achieve financial independence from their parents by going part-time to work in a factory and part-time to take their lessons in school. And they'd earn money. It's like, there are not enough factory jobs to have this much child labor. It's just ridiculous. I mean, it's like someone telling you in the future everyone's going to be a medical doctor. This is a highly specialized trade that influences just one part of society, and it is a small minority of our society that's employed in factories. And that's true even in China. China right now is going through a brief boom period where they have a huge amount of factory labor, but a lot of the factories that are now in China are going to close down and leave China. Some of them are going to move to Vietnam, some of them are going to move to India, so on and so forth. Some of them are going to move to Africa. That's already happened, interestingly. North Africa has a bunch of shoe factories recently relocated from China to Africa. That can happen too, okay? But nevertheless, worldwide and city by city, Marx is just completely factually wrong with his claim, both numerically, that the factory laborers are going to become this huge class representing the whole of society in the future society, and he's also wrong qualitatively. Because if you actually believe in this view of society, that people's minds are so completely taken over by class interest that they no longer care about nationalism or religion or any other sentimental political attachment, if that's what you believe, then necessarily all the other social classes are going to be the enemies of the industrial proletariat. And the industrial proletariat were then and would remain really a kind of minor social class, a minor political movement of no particular significance. So it doesn't make sense on many different levels. Okay, guys. So I close this video by just saying, not for the first time this week, the most important thing in philosophy is to have a helpful problem-solving attitude. And why is that? Philosophy, like politics, is fundamentally about problem solving. I would go so far as to say philosophy is politics directed towards problems that one person tries to solve alone in isolation, whereas in politics we take very much the same problem-solving toolkit, but directed towards problems that we try to tackle in groups of people or in aggregate or large societies as a whole. Philosophy may be more privately reflective in character, whereas politics is more publicly reflective in character. But nevertheless, these are problem-solving methods. And Marx is wrong precisely in that he does not have a problem-solving attitude looking at history, looking at politics, looking at economics. He instead uses this method of just trying to exaggerate the nature of the problem, exacerbate, dramatize the nature of the problem to the point where the reader is willing to make an ideological commitment to being part of the solution, and he presents that solution as a violent class struggle.